Hi, this is Tom Dwyer for Auto Tape Tours, reminding you that this section of our tour through Grand Teton National Park is based on a speed limit of 45 miles an hour. So check your speedometer and try to keep as close to that as possible. We're now headed for the Oxbow Bend viewpoint. As we cruise south, we're treated to a great view of one of the most awe-inspiring mountain ranges in North America. To our west, in all its majesty, looms the Teton Range. True, there are other ranges on our continent that are longer, wider, and taller. But for sheer magnificence, few can beat the eastern front of the Tetons. Nestled between the Tetons and the Gros Ventre Mountains, and hidden for centuries from the white man, lies the scenic splendors of Jackson Hole. Generally, the word hole is used to identify any area completely surrounded by mountains. In the early part of the 19th century, the fur trappers who came here named the holes after whichever trapper went there the most. In those days, there was Brown's Hole, Ogden's Hole, Pierre's Hole, and Jackson's Hole. Most of the names have since been changed. The only one that seems to have remained, with a slight revision, is Jackson's Hole. It was named after the famous fur trapper, David E. Jackson. Over the years, the possessive apostrophe and S were dropped, and now it's simply known as Jackson Hole. The valley floor of Jackson Hole is roughly 50 miles long by 10 wide. This western paradise has roads leading to it from all directions. From the north, a road comes in from Yellowstone and goes south through Hoback Canyon. From the east, a road comes over the Togati Pass and heads west over the Teton Pass. All these roads were originally Indian trails, later used by early fur trappers and now somewhat modernized for us. Let me remind you now, when you stop the car at a recommended viewpoint or just to snap some photographs, you're supposed to turn me off. That way we'll keep synchronized and what you're seeing will match what I'm talking about. The coniferous trees you see growing along here are lodgepole pine and subalpine fir. The lodgepole pine, incidentally, is a sort of a special kind of tree. It's the first to reseed and grow back after a forest fire. The cones of a lodgepole are extremely heat resistant, and a few weeks after a fire, the cones will crack open and scatter their seeds. Because these seeds germinate best on bare mineral soil with direct exposure to sunlight, the aftermath of a fire creates excellent conditions for the growth of lodgepole pines. Throughout the park, other coniferous trees include the whitebark pine, the limber pine, the Douglas fir, the blue spruce, and the Engelmann spruce. You'll find the Engelmann spruce growing mostly in moist places and near lakes and streams. Among the deciduous trees, the quaking aspen is the most common. The leaves of the quaking aspen spring from very slender stalks, and the slightest breeze puts them into motion. Because of this, they're called quaking aspen. Balsam poplar is found along some of the stream banks. Their leaves are about 3 inches long and 2 inches broad. The bark of a young balsam poplar is smooth and roughens as the tree ages. Its small seed pods contain many seeds, each of which has a tuft of white hair resembling cotton. It's this feature that's given the tree the popular nickname cottonwood. Small willows also grow in profusion along the streams and in the marshlands. The road we're on will take us to a junction. When we get to it, be sure to make a left turn, heading toward Moran and the Buffalo entrance station. If you go straight ahead, you'd be making the circle tour counterclockwise, and we'll both be all fouled up. So just make sure at the junction, make a left turn, and we'll be on our way to our recommended viewpoint, the Oxbow Bend Overlook. On our right, we're going to pass Jackson Lake Lodge. Just beyond that, we come to Willow Flats Overlook. That's not one of our scheduled auto tape tour stops, but if you have time, you may enjoy a visit there. Because below the marsh flats, you might see some moose feasting on the willows there. It's one of their favorite foods. The best time to catch them dining is early in the morning or late afternoon. In between, the moose may be enjoying a long siesta. Our next stop, the Oxbow Bend, is an abandoned meander of the Snake River. In this beautiful horseshoe-shaped lake, you'll probably find a large variety of waterfowl. Just opposite the viewpoint parking area are some cottonwood trees. In them, you may be able to see the large wood stick nests of the great blue herons. Oxbow Bend is also a favorite of white pelicans, geese, and various species of ducks. Otters, muskrats, and water-loving mammals are prone to set up housekeeping at Oxbow Bend, too. Of all its inhabitants, it was the elk that inadvertently played an important part in the commercial development of Jackson Hole. In the 1880s, when the white men settled in Wyoming country, thousands of elk lived here. But their population was reduced by agriculture, overgrazing, and the growth of a fraternal organization. Its members decided that the elk's ivory tusk made nifty jewelry. An affluent club member might part with as much as $100 for a pair. At such prices, it wasn't long before a wily group known as tusk hunters invaded the region. These opportunists would track down, knock out, and perform crude dentistry on the helpless elk. By the time the tusk hunters were driven away by angry locals, they'd unlawfully and unmercifully killed thousands of elk. To make matters worse, shortly after that, a series of hard winters left thousands of carcasses of starved elk strewn all over the valley. State and federal aid brought some relief, but the problem wasn't licked until groups of interested organizations bought 23,754 acres of hay and rangeland just outside the southeast border of the park and set it up as the National Elk Refuge. Today, thanks to their generosity, something like 7,000 to 9,000 elk spend winter vacations at the range, where food is plentiful. We have about a mile to go before we get to the Oxbow Bend viewpoint. You'll know we're there by the sign on the right side of the road. Turn me off now, but don't forget to turn me on again after we leave the viewpoint and are going south on the Jackson Hole Highway. A little less than 9 miles from here, we'll come to the Cunningham Cabin turnoff, our next recommended stop. To our right lies a stretch of land which was once known as Jackson Wildlife Range. This range is no longer officially maintained, but once in a while, some American buffalo, or bison as they're properly called, can be seen roaming here. If you don't see any, don't be disappointed. They're not usually around this time of year. The bull is a massive animal, weighing at maturity 2,000 pounds. Cows, of course, are smaller and weigh only 1,000 pounds. Only? Bulls and cows are both horned and have high-humped shoulders and short tails. Their blackish brown hair on the shoulders, neck, and head is long and woolly, while the hair on their hindquarters is dark brown and short in warm weather, but grows longer in winter. Actually, the times we're most likely to see any of the big wildlife in the park are during the late spring and early fall. In between, the large ones seem to duck the summer crowds. Even the bear in Teton stay pretty much in the background. Unlike those in Yellowstone, Teton bear don't usually hang around campgrounds. Within the park, there are several places where you can take off on a boat trip into the primitive wilderness. These are the famous Snake River float trips. One of them begins from a departure area a short distance ahead. The float trip delivers you from the civilized, mechanized, computerized world of today to the quiet, primitive world of yesteryear. For anyone yearning for a few hours to get away from it all, this is a perfect side trip. You can arrange for one of these trips before your auto tape tour is over by going to the Jackson Lake Lodge or at the Jackson Hole Chamber of Commerce. We'll soon come to the Buffalo entrance station. After we pass it, be sure to make a right turn on our road going toward Moose and Jackson. Otherwise, we'll cruise right out of the park. The first real settlers to Teton country came in the late 1880s. Then in 1891, when those settlers were just beginning to feel at home, President Harrison set aside a Yellowstone Park timber reserve. Part of this reserve took in the northern part of Jackson Hole. As a national forest, the land could still be used for commercial purposes. When talk of creating a national park got around, there was a great deal of dissension. A park, much of it taking in the reserve, would preclude the continuation of commercial operations. Nevertheless, there were many who thought Teton country so uniquely magnificent it should be preserved for future generations of Americans to enjoy. The campaign to turn it into a park was launched by Emerson Huff's article in the Saturday Evening Post in 1917. As the proposition gained momentum, the opposition grew louder. Time and again, they thwarted congressional attempts to designate the park. The backers of the park had to do something to weaken the opposition. In 1923, they held a meeting in the Maud Noble cabin. At the historic meeting was Horace Albright, former assistant director of the National Park Service. He and his colleagues hit upon the idea of privately buying up the land and donating it to the federal government, who could then turn it into a national park. In 1926, Albright discussed the idea with John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Rockefeller loved the Tetons. He agreed to help preserve it so that future generations of Americans might enjoy its wilderness splendor. In 1929, President Coolidge signed a bill that turned part of the Teton National Forest into Grand Teton National Park. But it was the generous land donations made by Rockefeller and other private citizens that gave the park the spaciousness it has today. In the 1940s, Secretary of the Interior, Harold Chapman, on behalf of the United States government, accepted Rockefeller's generous gift of approximately 35,000 acres of land. After the war in 1950, Congress consolidated this land with Grand Teton National Park. Today, thanks to the donations of public-minded citizens, Grand Teton National Park contains 500 square miles of rugged mountain beauty, and about 98% of it belongs to the federal government. Say, I hope you're maintaining that 45 miles per hour, so we'll stay in synchronization with what I'm saying. Our next stop is an historical site, the Cunningham Homestead Cabin. The cabin is about a half-mile off our road, the Jackson Hole Highway, but is well worth seeing. The cabin belonged to J. Pierce Cunningham, who came to Jackson Hole in 1885. With his wife, he set up a home on this site. The Cunningham Homestead Cabin was the scene of one of the most dramatic and famous events of this area. Here's how I heard the story. In 1892, two strangers came to Jackson Hole. One was Mike Burnett, a top cowhand, and the other was his buddy, burly George Spencer. Cunningham allowed them to winter a herd of horses on his grounds. Burnett and Spencer might have enjoyed a tranquil life on Cunningham's property if someone hadn't noticed that their horses carried strange brands. They were identified as horses belonging to a ranch in Montana. The following spring, a marshal from Montana and 6 deputies came snowshoeing over Teton Pass into Jackson. They enlisted help from local citizens there. Early one morning in April 1893, the posse quietly surrounded the Cunningham Homestead Cabin. 6 men hid in a shed, 150 yards northwest of the cabin. 3 others crouched low in the willows south of the cabin. When a dog in the cabin started barking, Burnett jumped up, dressed quickly, and grabbed a gun. He walked out to the corral to investigate. When a voice commanded him to throw him up, burly Burnett whirled and, drawing with lightning speed, fired twice in the direction of the voice. In return, one of the posse fired both barrels of a shotgun and killed Burnett, a standing target. In an instant, young Spencer appeared at the door of the cabin, blinking out the glaring daylight. In one hand, he carried a rifle, in the other, a shotgun. A posseman fired and missed Spencer. As the bullet sped past him, Spencer aimed and sent a bullet zinging through the hat of the posseman, creasing his skull. Crouching, Spencer surveyed the land around him, looking for signs of his enemy. Nothing moved, not a single sign of life anywhere. Spencer, thinking it was one man, stood up and shouted to the gunman to show himself. The only reply was the echo of his own angry voice. Disgusted, Spencer turned to enter the cabin. Before he could take a step, A bullet ripped through his back. Spencer never knew what hit him. He died instantly. The bodies of Spencer and Burnett were wrapped in a blanket and buried in an unmarked grave. The incident remains a touchy matter in the history of the region. The true story will probably never be known, and it's still disputable whether it was a case of justice triumphing or the injustices caused when a handful of men take the law into their own hands. In any event, all that remains of the incident now are a few bullet holes in an old log cabin. About 500 yards north of the cabin, a marker locates the site of an old log fort. The double-walled fort was built in 1895 by area settlers as protection against anticipated Indian reprisals. What made Jackson Hole residents afraid of an Indian attack? It started when Jackson Hole residents, under the leadership of Constable William Manning, surprised, disarmed, and arrested a hunting party of 9 Bannock Indians and their families. Marching back to Jackson, each Indian brave was flanked by 2 deputies. Their families trailed in the rear. At a spot in a dense forest, the party stopped. A trigger-happy deputy fired his gun. Thinking they were about to be slaughtered, the Indians panicked. Sobbing women and wailing infants distracted the captors, and in the melee that followed, the braves attempted to break away. 1 frail old Indian was killed. The younger braves escaped. When reports of the escape flashed around the countryside, Jackson Hole residents grew frantic. They were sure the escaped Indians would round up help from other tribes and retaliate. They built forts on 3 of the ranches in the valley. Settlers moved into the forts. 5 companies of the United States 8th Infantry Division were dispatched to Jackson Hole. Everyone waited nervously for the expected onslaught. It never happened. After a while, when they considered that they were no longer in danger, the settlers abandoned the forts. Years later, they were ripped down, so now there's no longer visible evidence of that incident. While the stories I just told you add to the color and drama of the Wild West of this area, far greater historical significance is found in stories of men like J. Pierce Cunningham. He and his family are true pioneers, the backbone of early Western settlers. His cabin is one of the few remaining examples of how most of the rugged pioneers really lived during the opening of the West. On our right, you'll see a marker directing us to the Cunningham Homestead cabin. I know you'll enjoy this stop, so turn me off for now. Don't turn me on again till after we've left the parking area and are back on this road headed for our next stop. Are we back on the main road? If not, turn me off till we are, then turn me on again. Our next stop will be at the Snake River Overlook, a little under 4 miles from here. To our right is the largest river in the park, the Snake River. It starts in Yellowstone National Park and flows out of Jackson Lake. The Snake meanders through the park, leaving it about 5 miles southwest of park headquarters. It wanders through other states and finally winds up in the Columbia River in Washington. Altogether, it runs 1,038 miles long, making it one of the longest rivers in the United States. No one knows for sure how it got its name. The Indians called it Yampapa, translation, the root. Some historians claim that an early geographer named the Snake River because of the way it twists and turns in its course. Others believe its name comes from the fact that it received its start in Snake Indian country. But the fact is, there's really no such tribe as the Snake Indian tribe. It's a name that was given the Shoshone Indians by members of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Most of the guides for Lewis and Clark were Arapaho Indians. The story goes that Clark asked one of his Arapaho guides what tribe the Shoshones belonged to. The Arapaho, a bitter enemy of the Shoshones, replied with sarcasm, "They snakes." Clark must have taken the reply literally, for since then, the Shoshones were stuck with the unhappy appellation. Before we get off the subject of snakes, thought you'd be happy to know that there are absolutely no poisonous snakes in Grand Teton National Park. You might find a few harmless western garter snakes or a rubber boa. This is a true boa and is closely related to the huge boa constrictors of the tropics. But the Teton's boa is rarely longer than 2 feet and is completely harmless. The Snake River Overlook is probably the most scenic overlook in Jackson Hole. Anyone interested and fascinated by the origins of our planet will find a special fascination here. The great diversity of ridges, terraces, channels, and depressions furnish a key to the phenomenal glacial events that took place in this region. Geologists tell us that in this area there have been 3 different periods of glaciation. From the Snake River Overlook, we can see results of 2 of those. One is the tree-covered hill you see across the Snake River there. That's a glacial moraine called Burnt Ridge, and it was formed about 15,000 years ago as a result of a geological era known as the Pinedale period. The glacier that covered the area here during that period is believed to have remained here till about 9,000 years ago. After a glacier recedes, there's debris left behind, and that's what's known as a glacial moraine. If you look beyond Burnt Ridge, you can see a line of trees rimming the mountains. That, too, is a glacial moraine. Scientists believe that one of the glaciers that covered this area must have shifted back and forth. This conclusion comes from the fact that north of here, there are a number of moraine islands and potholes, both of which are caused by glaciers. Sometimes during the existence of a glacier, water gets dammed up between its moraine and the ice front. When the glacier recedes and disappears, the dammed up water remains behind. In the case of Jackson Lake, that's pretty much what happened. Depending on the time of year, there are a number of sandbars visible in the Snake River. On one of them, Dead Man's Bar, we have a site of one of Jackson Hole's goriest murders. Many prospectors came here to seek gold in the gravel bar of the Snake River. One group of 4 Germans started sluicing rivers along here in the spring of 1886. Toward the end of the summer, John Toner, one of the group, took a job as a hay hand on one of the nearby ranches. When his new boss or any of the men asked him about his German friends, he refused to discuss them. Much later, their bodies were found on Dead Man's Bar when the river washed away the gravel that had been covering them. Toner admitted killing them, claiming self-defense. 2 of the victims' heads showed they'd been bashed with an axe and club, probably while asleep. The nearest court was 210 miles away. To make it easier to present the evidence, the heads of the 2 victims were boiled in an iron pot. Their skulls were then brought to the distant court. The evidence was clear, but because there were no witnesses to this grisly crime, Toner literally got away with murder. The stretch of this river where this heinous crime happened is still known as Dead Man's Bar. In the Jackson Hole Museum in Jackson, you can see the iron pot that was used to prepare the evidence that did not put Toner behind bars. We should very shortly be at the Snake River Overlook. Why don't you turn me off now? Look for the signs, and don't forget your cameras on this one. We'll probably get to our next viewpoint before I finish talking, so please don't turn me off till I give you the signal. Our next stop will be at the Teton viewpoint, which is a little over 3 miles from here. One of the park's outstanding features is its large, colorful variety of wildflowers. As a summer visitor to Jackson Hole, you'll see at best only a small percentage of the variety of flowers that are natural to this park. The species you see practically everywhere in the park is the Wyoming paintbrush. which, by the way, is the official flower of the state of Wyoming. You find this flower in a variety of colors, running from pale cream through yellow and pinks to almost every conceivable shade of red. In the park's high country, you'll find small clumps of tiny, brilliant, blue-flowered alpine forget-me-nots. The white Colorado columbine and the lamb's tongue fawn lily, also known as the glacier lily, grow at the edge of receding snowbanks. Fishing is a favorite and often rewarding sport in the park. To indulge the sport, you should get a Wyoming state fishing license and check out their regulations as well as the park regulations, because in most instances, both regulations have to be followed. There are a number of locations in the park where you can get fishing guides, boats, tackle, and licenses. Jackson, Jenny, and Lee Lakes are considered especially good for landing whoppers. What you can land, if you're lucky, are cutthroat, Mackinaw, brown, brook, rainbow, and hybrid trout, as well as whitefish. The rocky bottom of the Snake River makes it a happy home for trout, and fishing in the Snake is especially good in the fall. But early spring, mid-July, and August can be great if the waters are low and clear. If you're going to do any fishing, remember, get the necessary permits, and good luck. I hope you're maintaining that 45 miles per hour. At our next stop, Teton Point Viewpoint, you'll be able to see all three Tetons. Grand Teton is the tallest. It rises to 13,770 feet above sea level. Left of that is the next tallest, Middle Teton. That shoots up to 12,804 feet. And south of that is the South Teton, 12,514 feet above sea level. Grand Teton is the second highest peak in the state of Wyoming. Middle Teton is the third, and South Teton is the fifth. When you're driving the Jenny Lake Road, you can't see the Middle Teton, because from that vantage point, it's hidden behind the Nez Perce Peak. The Tetons have challenged mankind for ages. Going way back to the earliest times, stories and legends tell of hundreds who have tried to conquer Grand Teton, but until the 19th century, there's been no report of a single success. Then in a period of 30 years, two men claimed to have made the first successful climb. One of these men was Nathaniel P. Langford. In 1872, he was a member of the United States Geological Survey Party under the leadership of a Captain James Stevenson. The party was being guided by a gent known as Beaver Dick Lee, a trapper and guide who played an important role in the history of Jackson Hole. When Beaver Dick's group became intrigued by the idea of climbing the Grand Teton to its top, he assured them that it could never be done. This only whet the appetites even more. On July 28th, Captain Stevenson, Langford, and 12 others set out to prove Beaver Dick wrong. The trail they took was a tangled mass of fallen trees, but up they climbed. When they reached 9,000 feet, they ran into snowfields. Between the snowfields were huge, menacing boulders. Above them, the steep mountain jutted up to a 60-degree angle. Ice on the ledges made the climbing even more treacherous. But Langford and Stevenson were too close to call it quits. When they got to a point of 300 feet below the summit, they rested briefly before making the final push. At 3:30, after 10 hours of the severest labor of my life, wrote Langford, we stepped upon the highest point of the Grand Teton. He really believed they'd reached the top. His claim was undisputed until, in 1891, a surveyor named William Owen got the Grand Teton bug. In 1898, he set out with 3 others, and the first night on the mountain, they got as high as 9,000 feet. At 5 the next morning, they made their way across the perilous snowfield and discovered a ledge 16 inches wide and 25 feet long. This ledge, as it turned out, was the key to the climb. At 4 p.m., they made their way to the top, unfurled the flag, and chiseled their names on the rocks. When he returned, Owen insisted that he was the first to really reach the top. One of his favorite arguments was that Langford's descriptions of the terrain at the summit were inconsistent with what he saw. After considerable research and study by officials, Owen was given official recognition as the first man to reach the top of Grand Teton. To add to his glory, Mount Owen, the second highest peak in the park, was named after him. The Tetons are still a favorite among mountaineers because they're so rugged and require uncanny skill. Because they are so difficult, park officials have set up and enforce very strict rules about mountain climbing in the park. If you're considering taking even a short climb, don't. At least not before checking with the mountaineering headquarters at Jenny Lake Ranger Station. Just below timberline on the mountains, you'll see several places where you'd expect to see trees growing. But they don't, because those bare spots are where avalanches run down every winter. If any little tree were foolhardy enough to try to grow here, it wouldn't last very long. In a matter of months, a brutal avalanche would wipe it out of existence. You may turn me off now. I'll be back after we've left the viewpoint and are back on the Jackson Hole Highway, headed for our next stop. That is, if you remember to turn me on then. Our next stop will be at the Blacktail Pond viewpoint, just over 4 miles from here. To the east, the mountain you see is called Sheep Mountain. On the northern side of Sheep Mountain, there's a livid scar. That's the result of one of the greatest slides ever to hit this region. It happened June 23rd, 1925. At about 4:30 in the afternoon, the people who lived in a town called Kelly near here heard a loud rumbling. Although there had been small slides running off the north side of the mountain, the residents didn't take them too seriously. But a rancher named Guile Huff owned property where the thundering noise seemed to come from. He saddled up his horse and rode toward the noise to see what was happening. As he rode, he noticed a movement on the upper slope of the mountain. Suddenly, the face of the mountain seemed to be going berserk right before his eyes. It began to shake and tremble. Then it seemed like the whole mountain was moving toward him. Huff didn't know if he was imagining this or if it was really happening, but he wasn't about to wait around and find out. Quickly, he turned his horse and tried to race out of the path of what he realized was an avalanche. The faster he rode, the faster the avalanche seemed to come charging after him. It was a fantastic nightmare, and at one point, Huff turned back to see that the avalanche was practically on his heels. He thought he was a goner when miraculously the avalanche zigzagged crazily and went crashing through a fence no more than 30 feet away from him. He stared in horror, watching tons of loosened debris come crashing down the side of the valley, roar across it, and creep up the other side. In a matter of seconds, the debris piled up, turning into a 225-foot high, half-a-mile wide dam across the Gros Ventre River. The only reported casualties of the slide, now historically referred to as the Gros Ventre Slide, were Huff's cows. The many engineers who examined the dam assured the locals that it was solid and they were safe. 2 years later, the river overflowed and washed part of the dam away. The raging flood that resulted took 9 lives and left 40 families homeless. The town of Kelly, although it still exists, never did fully recover from this catastrophe. There's a road just down below Moose Junction that will take you to the town of Kelly. On the way there, you'd get a close look at the Gros Ventre Slide. In the town itself, you'd see what was once the Mormon chapel, now operating as a combination post office, gas station, and grocery store. Remember the lyrics to Home on the Range, especially those that go, "Where the deer and the antelope play"? Now, you want to hear something I bet you didn't know? There are no true antelope in North America. The antelope is native to Europe. When our forefathers saw the pronghorn, they mistakenly thought it was an antelope. And that's what they call it. I mention this because to our left are the Antelope Flats. At one time, there were thousands of antelope summering there. But nowadays, only a few spend their summers on the flats and the surrounding sagebrush country. At our next stop, the Blacktail Ponds Overlook, we'll be able to see how one animal can unintentionally create homes for other kinds of animals. The construction of beaver dams there created a marsh. In the marsh, other plants flourished, providing food and shelter for moose, muskrat, many kinds of waterfowl, and a variety of small birds. So you see, an ideal wildlife habitat was developed simply because the beaver is naturally industrious. Like other rodents, the beaver is equipped with a well-developed set of front teeth, set in strong jaws. In fact, if a beaver stopped gnawing, his teeth would continue to grow and would probably cause lockjaw. He'd be unable to chew and eventually would starve to death. A beaver's home, or lodge, consists of a platform of mud and sticks constructed some distance from the bank. The platform is built a few inches above the water, and above it, they fashion a dome-shaped roof. The house may be woven entirely of sticks, or sometimes they add a combination of brush and sod. Before winter, the beaver plaster the house with mud. The room inside may measure 10 feet in diameter and 3 feet high. Entrances open well under the water, so the beaver may pass in and out under the winter ice. You'll see several examples of their craftsmanship at Blacktail Ponds. At the upcoming sign, make a right turn for the quarter-mile drive to Blacktail Ponds. Turn me off now, and turn me on again after we've left the viewpoint and are back on this road. Moose Visitor Center, our next stop, is almost 2 miles from here. In a minute or so, we'll come to a junction where we'll make a right, continuing our circle tour of the park. If you don't make that right-hand turn, you'll wind up in Jackson, which I must say, you ought to visit before leaving the park. Soon after we make our turn off the Jackson Hole Highway, we'll cross the Snake River. Up to 1892, the only way to cross the Snake River was to ford it. At best, this was hazardous. Then in that year, William Meaner built a ferry and a small cabin. The crossing soon became known as Meaner's Ferry, and that's how it was marked on the maps. For a trip across his ferry, his rates were 25 cents for a horse and rider. Once, when a man boarded his ferry on foot, Bill Meaner told him, "You don't owe me a damn cent. Any man who can't afford a saddle horse can't afford the ferry." In 1918, Meaner moved to California and sold his property and ferry to Miss Maud Noble and Mr. Frederick Sandell. The new owners continued operating the ferry until 1927, when the Snake River Bridge was built to accommodate increasing traffic. Miss Noble and Mr. Sandell sold out to the Snake River Land Company. For years, the original buildings stood, and the old cable for the ferry, secure in its original anchorage, swung aimlessly across the river. From lack of use, however, everything began deteriorating. Then in the spring of 1949, with funds provided by Lawrence S. Rockefeller, Meaner's Ferry and all its buildings were restored as a historic landmark. The buildings are sometimes open to the public. When the water level permits, you may take a free trip across the river on the reconstructed ferry. Our stop at Moose Visitors Center marks the end of this side of our tape. So after you've turned me off, on signal, turn me over, as instructed on the cassette player. In Moose, you'll find a post office, the tackle shop, park headquarters, and the visitor center, where you'll see exhibits telling of the early history of Jackson Hole. After we leave Moose, heading north toward Coulter Bay, our auto tape tour will be based on a speed of 40 miles per hour. You can turn me off now. Remember now, going north, our tape is based on a speed of 40 miles per hour. Just ahead of us is the Moose Park entrance station. Less than half a mile past that is the turnoff that will take us to the parking area for the Chapel of the Transfiguration, Maud Noble's cabin, and Meaner's Ferry. The Chapel of Transfiguration is a unique rustic Episcopal church erected in the summer of 1925. People from all parts of the world have visited the church, whose window frames the awe-inspiring Tetons. The Maud Noble cabin has been preserved and kept intact. At the ferry site is the old homestead of William D. Meaner, the man who started it all by building a ferry across Snake River. We'll be at the road leading to the ferry site in a matter of seconds, so please turn me off now. The next stop on our tour of Grand Teton National Park will come up in a little over 4 miles. The road we're taking is called locally the Inner Road. As we cruise it, we're now about 6,600 feet above sea level. All that cobbly and gravelly material you see is part of a glacial outwash, arranged in what are referred to as benches. The tree-covered bench to our left is different from the one we just came over. That one is made of moraine material, which probably means zilch to you if you know nothing about geology. So I'll try to explain. When a glacier recedes from a valley, it leaves the granite stones and rocks which had pretty much settled around the outlines of the glacier. Such stones and rocks are called glacier moraine. The particular moraine we're talking about was formed by a glacier that receded from this valley about 9,000 years ago. A little later on, you'll see surrounding Jenny Lake and Lee Lake perfect examples of glacier moraines. Yet when you see forests growing out of these moraines, you might think I'm putting you on. First, I tell you glacier moraines are made up of granite boulders and stones, and then I say forests are growing from these moraines. And anyone knows you can't get trees from a stone, right? Wrong. What happened was this. The moraines contained, in addition to granite rock, gravel, sand, and silt. Long after the glacier receded, lichen began to grow on the rocks. Lichen is sort of a primitive plant, a combination of algae and fungi. The moraine soil, enriched by dead lichen, nurtured the growth of other more complicated forms of plant. As the process kept repeating, more and richer soil was built until finally, what started out as bare, hard granite rock became a beautiful flower garden populated with characteristic plants of the region. Of course, the process was slow and took thousands and thousands of years to happen. In fact, nature's cycle of forest succession never really ends. The mountain straight ahead is Mount Owen. It's the second tallest peak in the park, 12,928 feet high. Grand Teton, from our view here, is slightly to the left of Owen, and Tewanah is the one to the right. These three peaks make up what is called the Cathedral Group. In the Teton Range, there's one peak named Mount Wister. It was named in honor of Owen Wister, one of America's most famous Western fiction writers. It's believed that the major portion of his classic story, The Virginian, took place right here in Jackson Hole. Although his stories were fiction, many of his characters were based on actual Jackson Hole characters he knew or heard about. Jackson Hole did, of course, have its share of real outlaws. One of the most famous, or should I say infamous, was Edward B. Trafton. Among his countless offenses, Trafton served a term in jail for stealing $10,000 from, get this, his own mother. But Trafton's real claim to fame was as the merry bandit who single-handedly robbed 19 stagecoaches on the morning of July 29, 1914. If Trafton wasn't honest, he was at least systematic. He knew that there was a train of stagecoaches coming from Old Faithful to West Thumb. Because of the dust on the road, each stage would be at least several miles behind the other. So that morning, he tied a kerchief over his nose and mouth and crouched behind some bushes. As the lead coach passed Shoshone Point, Trafton bolted out and blocked the road. The driver pulled his horses to a jolting stop. Trafton warned the driver and the passengers not to make any false moves because his podna, hiding in the bushes, had a nervous trigger finger. He ordered the passengers out of the coach and had them toss their valuables into a sack. Terrified by the mythical trigger-happy buddy in the bushes, they obeyed, climbed back into the coach, and the driver trotted off, grateful no harm was done. As each approached, Trafton repeated his trick. It's amazing how cooperative everybody was. But the driver of the 20th coach had a hunch something was fishy. He turned his horses around and galloped back to Old Faithful for help. Before help arrived, the merry bandit had pilfered 19 stages and skipped off with the loot. His take was estimated at anywhere from $1,000 to $20,000. Unhappily for him, Trafton wasn't adept at escaping the law as he had been at breaking it. He was caught and sentenced to 5 years at Leavenworth. As we near our next stop, Glacier Gulch Viewpoint, you get a good view of the north face of the Grand Teton. The Teton Glacier is the largest glacier in the ice fields. Small compared to those in Alaska and Canada, it runs 3/4 of a mile long and 1/4 of a mile wide. You can take a trail to get near the glacier, but I warn you, it's a very strenuous hike. However, a lot of people think it's worth it once you get there. If you have a camera, you can take some wonderful shots of the ranges from the parking area using the trees as a foreground. You won't be able to see Teton Glacier, though, because from this viewpoint it's hidden behind the glacier moraine you'll see on the north face of the Grand Teton. Nevertheless, this viewpoint is one of the favorites among photographers. You may turn me off now. Turn me on again after we've left the viewpoint. Our next stop will be at the Jenny Lake Museum, a little over 2 miles from here. One of the most famous men who ever lived in this region was Richard Lee, the first white man to marry an Indian maiden in a Christian ceremony here. He was nicknamed Beaver Dick because, as the saying went, he could trap beaver where there weren't any. Beaver Dick's young Indian wife was called Jenny. That, of course, was the anglicized version of her Indian name. There's a sad story about the Lee family, and while the ending is tragic, it does reveal how kind they were. One day, a young Indian woman and her 3-year-old child came to the Lees' door for help. It was apparent that the woman was expecting another child. The Lees, who had several children of their own, took pity and invited the woman and child to share their food and shelter. They soon learned that the sickly woman had recently been widowed by smallpox, and that she was also suffering from the disease. The young widow died in childbirth. The Lees were now left with the orphaned 3-year-old who had, meanwhile, contracted the disease. While caring for the suffering child, Jenny and her 6 children were stricken. That winter, or to be more specific, the week of Christmas, Jenny Lee and her 6 children died of smallpox. In Grand Teton National Park, there are over 200 miles of maintained trails. You can explore almost all of them, either on horse or foot. Mostly they're about 3 or 4 feet wide, free of boulders, and many are graded so gently you can tramp miles of wilderness with a minimum of physical exertion. If you're thinking of getting away from the crowds and heading for the backcountry, I suggest you pick up a copy of the booklet called Teton Trails. You can buy it at visitor and information centers throughout the park. It's an awfully helpful little guide to have if you're not taking one of the many hikes conducted by the naturalists. Stay on the trails where it's the safest, and remember, the wildlife in the park is exactly that, wildlife. For a really enjoyable experience, your best bet is to take a hike conducted by the park naturalist. If you're interested, ask about it at the Jenny Lake Museum. The Park Service here offers many free activities to visitors. Weekly schedules for the season's park programs are posted at the park headquarters, in the museum, visitor centers, with desk clerks at most of the lodges, and in the post offices. You can make arrangements to participate in any of these wonderful naturalist programs at the Jenny Lake Museum or at the Coulter Bay Visitor Center. Jenny Lake is the second largest in the park. Its blue waters plunge 225 feet deep. Outboards are allowed, and fishing is especially good in spring and fall. Shore fishermen usually have better luck on the southwest shoreline. At Jenny Lake, the museum houses exhibits pertaining to the geology of the Tetons and to mountaineering. In addition to the museum, you'll find Jenny Lake Studio, Jenny Lake Ranger Station, and a campground. If you want further information about camping in the park, ask at the Ranger Station in Jenny Lake, which we are nearing now. In about 5 miles, we'll reach our next recommended stop, the Mount Moran viewpoint. Please go 40 miles per hour. Depending on traffic, you may get to Mount Moran viewpoint before I finish talking. If so, don't turn me off until I give you the signal. On Mount Moran, we can see Skillet Glacier. This was the scene of a tragic airplane crash in 1950. On November 21st, a plane flew into a blinding blizzard just east of the Grand. The pilot, worried about his 23 passengers, radioed to Idaho Falls for help. He was trying to make it back when he smacked into the northeast side of Mount Moran. The plane, which was owned and operated by the New Tribes Mission, went crashing down. Almost immediately, a 14-man team of men went up the mountain to see if there were any survivors. Among the team were Park Ranger Blake Vanderwater and a veteran mountain climber, Paul Pizzolt. It was the dead of winter, and snow in the low country was at least waist deep. You can imagine how deep it must have been in the mountains. The trip was, needless to say, a hazardous one. On their second day out, they ran into a fierce blizzard, and they had to rope themselves together to prevent slipping. Shortly after 11 o'clock, they reached the crash. The main body of the plane was demolished, but the tail was intact. Part of the plane had reeled 700 feet below onto the Skillet Glacier and burned. There was no evidence of a single survivor. Pizzolt and Vanderwater took pictures. They found the plane's log and identification and stuffed them in their pockets. They hurried off the mountain, knowing if they hung around too long, the storm would maroon them. The journey down was difficult and strenuous. The last part of the trip through the deep snows had to be made lying on their bellies on skis. Because of the treacherous winter conditions, everyone agreed it would be senseless to send a party to recover the bodies, at least not until the weather was better. The following July, 2 expert climbers, Vanderwater and Exum, went back to the crash site. It was still covered with snow, and there was little they could do. The following August, state, federal, civil aeronautics authorities, and other interested officials took climbing instructions at Exum's mountaineering school. Then with Pizzolt and Vanderwater, they made the 2-day climb to the wrecked plane. There was little left of any of the victims. The search party performed burial services as best they could. Then they gathered whatever could be returned to the victims' families and came down the mountain. To this day, fragments of the plane remain on the glacier. Did you know that one of the most famous and respected mountain climbing schools in the world is located right here in Jackson Hole? There's a good reason for its being established in Teton country. The Tetons you see are considered to be among the most challenging in the world. In fact, when mountaineers are planning to climb the Himalayas, they will often do their warm-up right here on the Grand. If a mountaineer can make it on the Grand, he knows he's got a good chance of making it on the Himalayas. That explains why the Park Service issues and sticks to their very strict rules about mountain climbing. They certainly don't discourage the sport. It's one of the outstanding attractions of the park, but they do know how dangerous it can be and take every step to see that participants follow their safety rules. No feature in the Teton seems to arouse more curiosity than the black streaks on the sides of 3 of its peaks. These are called dikes. One of them is on the southeast face of Mount Moran. Another is on the south slope of the Grand Teton.
and the third decorates the east face of Middle Teton. Visitors to the park are constantly asking and speculating about them. One of the most common guesses is that they're cracks in the mountains. Others think they are stairways. Actually, these bands are older than the Teton Range itself. They're made up of rocks that date back to pre-Cambrian times, over 500 million years ago. The bands result from cross-section exposure of dikes, the tabular structures formed through molten rock called magma, rising into a fissure and solidifying. The Teton dikes might well provide textbook illustrations because the contrast between the black intrusions and light-colored rock is so striking. Like other crystallines, they were exposed when the Teton block, after uplift, was stripped of its cover of younger rocks. It's amazing how visitors estimate the width of these dikes. The Mount Moran dike, for example, has been assigned widths ranging from 10 feet to 1,000. Actually, it measures 125 feet at the base of the peak. The Grand Teton dike is 40 to 60 feet wide, and the Middle Teton is 20 to 40 feet wide. Where a dike has more resistance than the rocks that enclose it, it stands in relief as straight high walls. Where there is less resistance than their enclosing rocks, they form narrow depressions. In the Middle Teton dike, snow often remains in its groove until late summer. So instead of a black band, you may see a white one. Mountaineers find the Grand Teton dike an excellent pathway for reaching the west side of the Grand. Please take a look at your speedometer. I hope it says 40 miles an hour. We'll get a fantastic view of some of the most inspiring peaks in the world. Looking at them, you can't help but wonder about their origins. If we could stretch our minds to imagine what the Earth looked like millions of years ago, we wouldn't recognize the landscape we see today. To tell you the story of the Rockies, we'd have to go back over 1 billion years. At that time, geologists believed the Rockies were merely the flat bottom of sea that extended from the Arctic to the southern part of California. Over thousands and thousands of years, rivers from neighboring highlands would dump into this sea. They'd bring millions of tons of sand, silt, and limey ooze, adding to the plants, animals, and other materials that had already accumulated on the floor of the sea. All the material was distributed in nearly horizontal layers on the floor of the sea. Over countless years, pressure and natural cement have hardened these deposits, turning them into sedimentary rocks, sandstone, limestone, and shale. Eventually, the sea receded, leaving a huge flat area of land. For Earth, life was seldom peaceful. Either violent tremors were shaking her frame or floods were raging over her, and each commotion left its permanent mark on her face. During one of these tumultuous periods, an incredibly powerful thrust from the southwest pushed up the crust of the Earth, turning it into long folds. The old sea bottom, thick with sediments, was lifted thousands of feet into the air, emerging as massive block-like structures above the Earth's surface. What sculpted these belts into ranges of high peaks and low valleys? Water and glaciers. You see, a running body of water and glaciers carry mud and sand and other abrasives. Over millions of years, the abrasive action caused by these sediments chiseled away at the block-like structures, leaving deep valleys and imposing peaks. Then long after, very long after the Rockies were lifted from the bowels of the Earth, there was another geological phenomena. This happened in the past 1,000,000 years. Little by little, the climate grew colder, drier. Summers became shorter, winters longer. Greenery disappeared, and animals and birds fled to warmer climates. It was the beginning of the Ice Age. For a long time, most of this valley was filled with great sheets of ice. A glacier so large and thick, it covered lake basins, river flats, canyons, and even lowland mountains. In fact, even as recently as 9,000 years ago, valley glaciers flowed from the crest of the Teton Range down to Jackson Hole. Eventually, the climate settled down to pretty much the climate we know today, and the huge glaciers melted or fragmented. In fact, the glaciers we see today in the park are like miniatures compared to the king-size ones that dominated the region during the Ice Age. But even though they are smaller, they are, along with nature's other tools of erosion, continuing to carve and shape the Grand Teton Mountains. The Tetons are considered distinctive among mountains as they are a striking example of the fault block type. As you can see, they rise steeply more than a mile from the flat valley to their craggy summits. There are no foothills whatsoever. Actually, this steep eastern front is the result of a recent geological uplift of the range along a great fracture line, a fault in the Earth's crust. Less than 9 million years ago, and that's recent as geological time goes, deep and powerful pressures caused a series of breaks in the Earth's crust. These breaks are called faults. The most spectacular of these was the Teton Fault. East of the fracture, the land sank, and that sunken land is now the valley of Jackson Hole. West of the fault, the land rose. The land that lifted high in the air is the Teton Range. Who knows what's going to happen in the next million years? Scientists can predict, but nobody knows for sure. You can turn me off now. Our next stop will be at the Jackson Lake Lodge, 7 4/10 miles from here. We're now going through pothole country. Potholes, or as they're technically called by geologists, kettles, are depressions in the Earth's surface. They happen as a result of a glacier period. When patches of ice remained after the glacier receded, the ice eventually became buried by materials that washed over them. As the ice melted many years later, the materials above it dropped down, creating a hole that looks like it was scooped out by a giant shovel. Some of the potholes here are still deep enough to contain water. To get a real good look at the potholes, you can take a 5-mile drive up Signal Mountain Road. The view from the summit of Signal Mountain is a spectacular one. There you can get an entirely different perspective of Mount Moran, Jackson Lake, and the Snake River. That lake you see on our left is Jackson Lake. It's the largest glacial lake in Jackson Hole and the second largest natural lake in all of Wyoming. This lake has a very unusual and complex origin. It was formed by a combination of a glacial groove scooped out by ice flowing south from Yellowstone National Park, a westward tilting of the valley floor, and by being dammed by moraines from Teton glaciers. Jackson Lake attracts more fishermen than any other lake in the park. Game fish are abundant here. An angler can grapple with cutthroat, lake trout, brown, brook, and rainbow trout. There are plenty of non-game fish, too, including the rosy-side sucker, Utah Creek chub, silver-side minnow, dusky dace, sculpin, and a few mountain suckers. Sportsmen are allowed to fish during the winter, but not till about November, after the Mackinaw trout spawning period is over. Before 1889, there were no Mackinaw trout in the park's lakes. But in August of that year, the first batch of Mackinaw trout were brought to the lake. Containers crammed with 300 2.5-inch fish were shipped by rail, hauled by wagon, and then mule-packed over an 18-mile trail to get them to Jackson Lake. Some skeptics thought the poor fish would never survive the 18-mile trek, but they did. The motion of the pack animals and the splashing in the cans aerated the water, thus keeping them alive. From then on till 1916, additional Mackinaw were planted in Jackson Lake. They made themselves right at home and showed a happy ability to reproduce. Today, Mackinaw trout can be found in all the lakes of the valley. The largest fish to be caught in Jackson Lake, at least the largest one on record, weighed over 40 pounds. Grand Teton National Park is a paradise for bird lovers. More than 200 species of birds live in the park. This may not seem like a lot compared to other parks, but for an area with an elevation from 6,250 to 13,770 feet, this is a pretty respectable variety. In almost all parts of the park, you can find the mountain bluebird and a few other species. But mostly, you'll find that each species of birds has picked out a particular spot that suits him best. A good place to find a wide assortment is in the river bottom community. Along the riverbanks, it's very likely you'll see, or certainly hear, the yellow warbler, the chirping sparrow, and the black-headed grosbeak. If you hear the sound of the grosbeak coming from one spot, and that spot is a cluster of shrubbery, you might investigate. You may see a male grosbeak helping take care of his young while he exercises his lungs. When you're in the vicinity of a river, look for the mallards, Barrow's goldeneyes, and the common mergansers. Around the Snake River, you can see some nests made by bald eagles. They're a vanishing species, and the park officials take special care to see that nobody bothers them. Many people make the mistake of assuming that sagebrush areas have no bird life. The truth is, there's a good variety of birds in sagebrush country, but they're hard to find. Their coloring, which blends in with the background, makes them almost invisible to us. But they're there all right. All you have to do is listen. If you really want to see who lives in the sagebrush flats, the best time to go there is at dawn. At those early hours, you may spot brewer sparrows, vesper sparrows, and sage thrashers perched on tops of shrubs singing their hearts out. Another bird found in sage country is the large sage grouse. At small lakes and ponds, you can find yellow-headed blackbirds, coots, and many species of waterfowl. Christian Pond, about 1 mile east of Jackson Lake Lodge, is a particular favorite of the trumpeter swan. This bird is a native to our continent and is, in fact, one of the rarest species in the world. It also enjoys the distinction of being the world's largest waterfowl. It can weigh from 20 to 30 pounds and has a wingspread of over 7 feet. A hardy species, the trumpeter swan has been known to live for more than 30 years. Of all the trumpeter swans living in the United States, more than half of them make their homes right here in Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks. Most of the larger lakes don't attract too many birds, except Jackson Lake. There you may find western grebes, common loons, and an occasional raft of redhead ducks. Along the willow flats we're traveling now, you may see the sandhill crane, and if you're lucky, some trumpeter swan. Although the morainial forests are very much like the river bottom forests, there's a surprising difference in the kinds of birds they attract. In the morainial forest, during summer months, you'll probably find nests of the Williamson sapsucker and the northern three-toed woodpecker. If it's a woodpecker you want to watch, just walk quietly into a strand of aspen. Before long, you'll hear something like this. And you'll know the woodpecker's around. While you're there, you can also look for the most misunderstood bird of all, the great gray owl. If you don't see him, you may hear him. The wet willow flats throughout here are where the moose are. Willow is one of their favorite foods, and the flats are like one enormous kitchen to them. I don't know if it's because they eat a lot, but the moose is the largest antlered mammal. A mature bull moose in Wyoming can weigh as much as 900 pounds. The bulls in the Rockies are much smaller than those in Alaska. Those fellows might tip the scale sometimes at 1,300 pounds. It's believed that this has a lot to do with climate. There are only 300 moose in the Tetons, but because of their size and coloring, it's not easy for them to hide from public view. On this tour, it's very likely you'll see some of them. If you do, please be careful. Although they may act aloof and indifferent, a moose is potentially dangerous. A mama moose will attack if she thinks her newborn are threatened. In fact, this is true of most of the park's wildlife. The park's coyotes have become a pretty brazen lot and are not as people-shy as you might expect. A coyote is about the size of a small German shepherd. Its coat is thick, coarse, and generally a grayish-brown. The bobcat, the lynx, and the mountain lion are three members of the cat family that slink around the park. The mountain lion, also known as a cougar, is the world's fourth largest cat. The body of a male mountain lion may be from 4 to 5.5 feet long, and its tail can measure 2 to 3 feet long. The female mountain lion is noticeably smaller. A mature mountain lion might weigh as much as 200 pounds, but is more likely to be 130 to 150 pounds. Of the three members of the cat family, this is the least likely to be seen in the park. The bobcat and the lynx are similar in appearance. Both look like oversized house cats. The fur of the lynx is grayish, while the bobcat's fur ranges from a pale brown to reddish brown. Truthfully, all three members of the cat family, while they do exist in the park, are quite rare. Soon we should be coming to Jackson Lake Junction. When we reach the junction, we continue straight ahead north towards Jackson Lake Lodge. Just about now, in fact, you may be able to see the lodge up on the rise ahead of us. When it was originally established, it was called the Amoretti Inn. That was in 1922. Later on, its name was changed to Jackson Lake Lodge, and that name was transferred to the new building when it was built in 1955. The cost of building the present Jackson Lake Lodge was over $6 million. The late John D. Rockefeller, Jr. was instrumental in choosing the exact location of the building. He wanted to be certain that from the lodge, visitors would get the most exciting views of the surrounding area. As a result, the main lounge picture window, 60 feet wide and 2 stories high, acts as a magnificent frame for the incredibly beautiful Tetons. At Jackson Lake Lodge, in addition to overnight accommodations, you'll find a restaurant, coffee shop, cocktail lounge, barber and beauty shops, fountain room, service stations, saddle horses, and top-level entertainment in the evening. We'll be taking a left turn to get to the parking area of the lodge. So turn me off now. Don't turn me on again till after we've left the lodge and we're back on this road, headed north toward Coulter Bay Village. Enjoy your stop here. In a little over 4 miles, we'll arrive at Coulter Bay Village. For now, look over to your right. The tree-covered hill you see is called a volcanic vent.
The enormous volcanism in this section of the country really happened in the Yellowstone National Park area, and that was as recent as 500,000 years ago.
But volcanic vents did open up within and along the borders of Grand Teton National Park. Major eruptions occurred at the north end of the Teton Range, east of Jackson Lake and south of Spread Creek, spitting out enormous amounts of volcanic cinder and fragments of congealed lava. Grand Teton National Park harbors a large variety of smaller mammals. By far, the largest in population are the rodents, or gnawing animals. This classification of wildlife ranges from the teeny tiny jumping mice who weigh less than an ounce to the beaver, which surprisingly may weigh up to 70 pounds. All rodents have one common distinguishing feature: their gnawing teeth. Most of the gnawing animals are vegetarians. The muskrat, like so many of this species, is a nocturnal animal, but occasionally you may see one swimming quietly along the surface of a pond or stream. The red squirrel is probably one of the cutest and most appealing of the park's small animals. It has a reddish coat and light underparts. If the stone you're studying starts to move, don't be alarmed. It's the yellow-belly marmot. It has a unique talent for lying perfectly still and blending in with its surrounding scenery. The only gopher in the park is the northern pocket gopher. About 8 inches long, including its 2-inch tail, its coloring is light brown. The rabbit family is represented in the park by the pika, the snowshoe hare, and the white-tailed jackrabbit. The latter two are entirely white in the winter, but change color with the seasons. Jokes are forever being made about the ability of rabbits to reproduce, but this tendency happens to be true of many other species which eat only plants. This is one of nature's ways of maintaining a numerical balance. A large number of easily multiplied small animals means that they won't quickly become extinct, in spite of the fact that larger, carnivorous animals are likely to gobble them up for lunch. Grand Teton National Park, like all national parks in the United States, comes under the supervision of the United States Department of the Interior. Under their aegis, the park is staffed by members of the National Park Service. The park rangers and naturalists in Teton are true men of the wilderness. The knowledge that some of them have of the geology, geography, and history of the park is, to say the least, substantial. At the same time, they're rugged outdoorsmen. They're anxious for you to enjoy your visit and will gladly share their enthusiasm for the park with you. In return, please obey the rules and regulations they've set forth in their desire to preserve this park as a sanctuary for wildlife and to retain its primitive beauty for the enjoyment of other people. The next stop on our autotape tour is at Coulter Bay Village. Coulter Bay was named in honor of John Coulter, the first known white man to come to Jackson Hole. In history books, John Coulter's chief claim to fame is as the pioneer who discovered the area we now know as Yellowstone National Park. But as a character, he was one of the most famous and colorful figures to come out of the West. If all the stories about him are true, John Coulter would have had to have been a sort of Western Superman. The trouble is that so many of the hair-raising tales about him were circulated by Coulter himself. He was, it seems, given to telling tall stories merely to amuse and entertain. Many of the stories were later proven to be quite true. One that I heard is supposed to have happened in 1807. During that winter, Coulter was captured by a band of hostile Blackfeet Indians. The young braves that caught him decided to play a rather sadistic game. They ripped off all of his clothes and had him run for his life again. Dressed only in his birthday suit, Coulter bolted toward the Jefferson River 7 miles away. Following him were the braves, armed with lances. One of the braves suddenly caught up to Coulter, but Coulter was a cool character. He grabbed the young brave's lance, and the Indian, caught off balance, fell to the ground. Coulter stabbed him to death. He then raced for the river, where he hid under a pile of driftwood while the remaining Indians searched for him the rest of the day. When night came, the naked and shivering Coulter crept out and quietly searched his way to the safety of the fur trading post, a mere 300 miles away. Some time later, starved and exhausted, Coulter arrived at the trading post. His body was bent and emaciated, but the spirit of John Coulter could not be broken. In Jackson Lake, there's a bay named for him, and if you stop there, you'll see a memorial in his honor. When we get to Coulter Bay, you'll find plenty of wonderful activities to choose from. Swimming there is excellent, and so is fishing. You can rent a boat to go fishing, or just take a relaxing trip on the tranquil waters. Of course, from Coulter Bay, you can hike any number of trails that'll take you away from the maddening crowds, deep into the spectacular wilderness of the park. If you wish to stay overnight, Coulter Bay offers cabins and tent cabins. Also at Coulter Bay, you'll find a cafeteria and grill, a general store, a gift shop, post office, a horse corral, a bathhouse, service station, tap room, a laundrette, and a visitor center. Those of you who are continuing the Circle Tour, please turn me off on signal. Enjoy your visit to Coulter Bay. After you turn me off, don't turn me on again till after we've left the village and are on the road headed for Oxbow Bend. Turn me off now, please.